Hello everyone, this is Dig FM and the FileMaker user group meeting for October 2015. And it's also our FMPug Without Borders meeting, so we are doing a simulcast on both at the same time. Hello everyone, this is Richard Carlton. I'm the Senior Engineer and CEO of RC Consulting, and I'm also one of the main trainers at learningfilemaker.com. Now, a number of you have asked for an ongoing user group meeting. Frequently I hear from people who don't have a good local user group. Well, this online broadcast is for you. This is the worldwide FileMaker user group and allows us to offer you the best possible content when Dig FM is available or not available. So every month I coordinate with FileMaker corporate staff to determine if we should do a live broadcast at Dig FM in Santa Clara, California. Sometimes FileMaker wants us to broadcast a user group meeting live, and other months it just doesn't really make sense to do that. Well, this month is awesome because we have a live broadcast here with live bodies. It's very exciting, and we're actually at FileMaker headquarters. Now, Jason is not quite ready yet. He's still eating pizza. So in the meantime, I'm going to tell you briefly about our wonderful sponsor here, which is learningfilemaker.com. And we have two courses here that are very popular, and actually a brand new course, which is our FileMaker for Startups and Entrepreneurs course. So whereas the Pro 14 course is largely a technical course, which has about 33 hours of video and about 200 videos, the Entrepreneur and Startups course is about planning and working on requirements and bug testing and go-to-market ideas, all those kinds of considerations. So if you're thinking about getting into FileMaker as a vertical market app, or you're a small business and you're being completely overwhelmed, and you don't have FileMaker, then those are good courses for you to look at. Now, there are some free online resources that are available. There is a number of things online. You can go search for free and the word FileMaker at the same time. There's also FM Starting Point, which is our free CRM software, which is very popular. In fact, we have a major redesign of that with the new Apple UI that will be out most likely next month. It's already well into testing, so we have exciting things coming there. Also, all the videos that we make available, including the user group videos, are available at FileMakerVideos.com. So it's a huge collection or repository of available videos that are waiting for you. Now, in recently released videos, we've talked about Raspberry Pi and WebDirect and all sorts of mayhem that caused. We also have a video on setting up email campaigns in FileMaker Pro, processing credit cards, etc. Once again, those are previous recordings are at FileMakerVideos.com. And let me see. There we go. This is the slide I want to do. So we are heading into the actual presentation at 7 o'clock. Tonight we have presenting with us, I have the long rap sheet here. This is Jason Erickson from Linear Blue. And Jason, we're going to turn his mic on in just a second. But Jason is famous for being a creator of SyncDeck. Now, you bob your head no if I say something that's incorrect, right? SyncDeck has all sorts of different tiers of availability for you to purchase, but it's basically a synchronization tool. And so he's part of the Linear Blue team now. So SyncDeck is now one of their flagship products for Linear Blue. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Jason. We're going to make him the presenter and also turn on his microphone.
Okay, check, check, yeah. Okay, excellent. That was too easy. Well, hello everybody. Thanks for having me. I've done a few talks down here in the past, so it's been a little while. Minor correction to Richard. Thank you, by the way, for the intro. This year we released actually a new product called Sync Server Pro, and it's really the extension of SyncDeck. So I'm going to talk tonight about that. So again, my name is Jason Erickson. I'm the CTO of Linear Blue. Linear Blue has offices in Hong Kong, San Francisco, and London. So we have basically 24-hour capability to do development, and starting to pitch that a bit more to take advantage of that market opportunity. We also make products, of course, SyncDeck and Sync Server Pro that I'm going to show you tonight, being a couple of them. What is Sync Server Pro? It's a Java-based background engine, typically installed on your FileMaker server or on your database server. It talks to FileMaker and SQL servers over JDBC. It essentially pulls the configured tables for adds, changes, and deletes. and then uses that collected data to provide various replication and auditing services, which sort of makes it a little bit of a Swiss Army knife of replication. So it gives you some different things you can do with it, and I'm going to talk about some of those tonight. It was built from the SyncDeck core engine. So essentially the 15 years of experience we put into building and maintaining and improving SyncDeck, we get to take advantage of with Sync Server Pro, and yet we're able to, and certainly plenty of experience in many customers, but we've built a brand new UI to it. We took advantage of FileMaker 14's awesomeness, couldn't resist, and so instead of a web-based interface, it's now FileMaker 14 interface. The interface file is just a standalone mechanism that lets you talk to the sync engine. So it's not in any way connected to your databases or required to be open or anything along those lines. It's just something you can open when you want to in order to be able to manage things. So with that, we basically got a much easier implementation and setup. Over the years, I think what we've learned the most is just the difficulty people sometimes have, not only getting it set up, but when you put a product out there and you spend maybe a week getting it all up and running, and then you walk away, and then a year later, you've now got to come back and work with it. You don't remember how to do it. So every time anybody wanted to do anything, it was just, it was a little more difficult than it ought to be. It's also a little less expensive, and the pricing model is quite a bit simpler than what SyncDeck had. And in fact, for this time, for this first release, we're very, very happy to say we now have a free version of the product, and I'll talk about what that version lets you do. But there's some nice tools in that one. So the uses, I'm going to talk about Redeployment Assistant. This is the first time we're rolling anything out like this. It's not radically different from what you're able to do with the product, more than it is a ability to use the product in a way that we really haven't thought of. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But essentially, it's, and this is with the free product, something you can use to aid in offline development. And I'll get into what I mean by that. Disaster recovery, again, free, is the ability to do local, iterative, continuous backup and restore. So in other words, your sync server engine has to be installed on your FileMaker server, and then that gives you the ability to protect a database, but it doesn't give you quite as much protection as you'd get from, let's say, having that be on a remote server, which comes with one of the other pricing models. Along the disaster, Richard?
You are going to talk about how that's different than FileMaker.
I am.
Someone's going to ask that question.
My first presentation, I didn't, and then the question went up, and from then on, I did. You're also able to keep essentially what could be deemed hot standby servers ready, so that if one server goes down, you're immediately able to switch users over to the secondary server, which is in sync and ready to go. Server-side audit logging is another typical use. So, there's some techniques out there for building audit logs. There's some plugins. We even had a plugin. But the FileMaker platform has become, a complicated enough beast that if you really need audit logging without a server-side process to do it for you, you're looking at some difficulties. So a plugin is going to work for Pro, not going to work for Go, not going to work for WebDirect. Some of the layout-based mechanisms, triggers, and things along those lines. Those are great for Pro. They're layout specific, but they're still okay for Pro. But they're no good if you have custom web publishing and other things that can't easily invoke those. And that also, with the audit log, gives you some ability to roll back as well. So fix deleted records that shouldn't have been deleted. And then finally, kind of the most sophisticated use of the product, local access, multi-server syncing. Multi-site syncing, and that really is the bread and butter. It has been for SyncDeck, and I expect it'll continue for Sync Server Pro. Gives you the ability to have servers in each location and be free from any connectivity issues, have the best possible LAN performance, and in some cases overcome just literally an inability to work over the WAN with particular FileMaker systems. All right, so standby. I'm calling it standby temperature, and that's kind of the key. So there's cold, warm, and there's hot. What FileMaker introduced with FileMaker Server 14, awesome. And I'm sure nobody's more interested to see where that evolves as we move forward. But at the moment, it's a cold standby. Action is required to bring the other server up when one goes down.
Yeah.
It's not there, it's not up and And there's some user switching involved with that as well.
Yeah.
All right. So what I would deem what I would deem warm, and by the way, Sync Server Pro does not ship as a hot standby. What I would call it is a warm standby, and the reason is your servers are up and running, they're in sync, you can immediately switch users to them. There's no action required to do that, but you do have to switch users. So one goes down, the user somehow has to end up on another server, and that is not inherently built into the product. We provide a replication system. However, I should really call this near hot, but with just a little bit of jiggering, you can go from slightly to very sophisticated user switching to essentially augment the warmness that we bring, the warmth that Sync Server Pro brings, to a near hot. And I'm actually going to show a little example of that too. Okay, so let's just talk pricing for a minute. I mentioned, so there's three-tier system, so a lot simpler than the licensing used to be. It was a little more difficult for people to figure out what they needed. You're buying one of 3 tiers, or you're not buying a tier at all. If you're buying tier 1, it's free. And that, like I say, gave you the local backup, the local restore, the local restore, and the roll forward capability. And we'll look at that. With tier 2, you have the ability to do remote backup of your data. So literally your data, as it's being piped out, as it's being collected every minute or so, can be as far flung as you want it to be for the best possible protection. It also adds the audit logging, and as I mentioned previously, with the audit log, you can do rollbacks. And then finally, tier 3 is a multi-server syncing. Starts with 2 servers at 2850, and then you can add additional servers for 850. And there's really no limit to the number of servers. So, you know, we have some environments where people have just offices literally all over the world, and every single office has their own server. 15, 20, I think is the current go. All right, so we're going to get into a demo. I'm going to start with tier 1 and just show you some disaster recovery in action, and we're going to look at the redeployment assistant, and I'll explain more of what I think you can do with the product to aid in offline development. So first off, let me just explain a little bit of what I have going on. I've got Parallels running on my computer, and I've got FileMaker Server running on that. I've got a little database here called CMC, and I've also got a little database called Sync Server Pro, which is what we give you. So that's running there as well. And I've actually got Sync Server Pro open already, and we'll take a closer look at that here in just a little bit. So I've got a little opener file that's just local to my computer, and it's opening up, as you can see, the database called CMC. Takes a second to load here. All right, and I should mention one other thing. I've already made a backup recently, which is just sitting here on my desktop. I made it just before we started the demo. That guy over. And we'll come back to that in a second. So I'm just going to make a quote. Let's see if we can get this to move. Nothing too simple. Nothing too complicated. Just say add a company. And we'll pick linear blue. And add clients. We'll pick Paul. This quote is for Paul. Okay, and I'll add a line item while I'm at it. Okay. So we've made a quote, we've made a line item, and there's some sub-items that go along with that. Now, ordinarily in a production environment, I'm about to crash this in a second, but let me just do one step that I'd prefer to do actually live and let you see. Ordinarily in a production environment, Sync Server Pro would be, as I mentioned, running on your FileMaker server and syncing, let's say, every minute. I've turned it off so that it's actually on demand, just so I can show you what the process is. So I'm in this main interface. If I wanted to, I could add new solution settings. I'm just going to pick this one that I already built, and I'm actually going to trigger a run cycle. And so you can actually see the process going through. So this is the dashboard interface. You can see there's some other functions, and hopefully there will be time and I can come back and talk a little bit about what some of those other things do. But that's just the basics and it gives me a little summary when it's finished telling me types of activity that it did and some counts. So that's fine. So the next thing we'll do is actually simulate a crash. So I'm just going to come back in here, over to my FileMaker server, and just close the file. Okay, of course, if we come back over to FileMaker, we get the familiar file close dialog. And we'll let that close down. And we'll come back to this little starter file in a little bit. So now that I've closed it, I'm just going to delete it from my server altogether. And the point here, I guess I should just make very clear what we're doing. We made a backup maybe yesterday. Maybe it turns out our best backup because of some corruption is 3 weeks ago. Doesn't really matter. I find the best backup I can. Because the data has been collected ever since that backup was made, I can go get that data and use it to update the backup that I do have, whatever it happens to be. So I'm just going to install that, throw it into my databases folder, and open it up. Oop. Okay. And now, of course, we can reopen it. We're opening CMC. And just to illustrate, we're going to go and filter for linear blue quotes. And this should be, yeah. Oop. I didn't need to do that. As you can see, it's not in there. The quote we just made, there are some ones that I was doing earlier, but this quote was not the one we just did. Bottom line, that came in earlier. That was pants, not shoes. I think I just did. Okay. So we're going to open up our little Sync Server Pro file and go back into that solution. And in this case, I'm just going to say, okay, well, I want to roll forward. So some of the things we did, for anybody familiar with SyncDeck, hopefully you see that there's a lot more sort of right up front the tools that you need to use. These tools, most of these tools were all there. They were just a bit more obscure to find. So just to zoom in, sorry to our web users, but everybody else can see. It's suggested a roll forward time, and that time is always just now, so that if you don't know what you're doing, you can't really get yourself in trouble by clicking go. But what I actually want to do is back this up a bit. I'm just going to say, let's take it back to 7 o'clock. And I could choose, if I was doing more of a specialty thing here, maybe recovering a particular table, I could choose particular tables that I have configured, but in this case, I just want to do everything. One more chance to back out. Nope, let's do it. If we back out of here. So we see it's going through, and it's essentially finding what has occurred since the last time, and again, giving me a summary, total restored 3, and then gives me a little summary by table, what it actually did. And now if we come back into our quotes, and redo that, we get our extra order back. For shoes. So I'm going to stop at that point, see if anybody has any questions, see if there's any anything that was confusing about that, or the data is stored wherever you choose to install the Sync Server Pro engine. Free version, it has to be on the FileMaker server, inside of a Java-based database, an Apache project Java-based database called Derby. And the data itself, I should mention, while stored in the database, is actually also compressed and encrypted, so that even if you can hack into that particular database, the individual record data is encrypted. All right, so let's take a look at this and just make sure. No, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. That's a great question. That's a great question. One of the things that happens when, and maybe if we have enough engineers in the room, I can get some correction on this. But when you're storing the data as FileMaker, you're working with completely different data than you're working with when you pull it out through JDBC. There's really no way to pull out corrupted data through JDBC and store it. The corruption happens inside the data file itself. So where you have room for corruption, if something didn't get stored correctly, and you now have a corruption, or there's a block missing, there's an index issue, that's not going to happen with data that you successfully pulled out of FileMaker in the first place and put away somewhere. Because essentially, in order to get that, you have to get the text version of the data. You can't pull out the corrupt blocks with it. Does that? Well, if we never collected it in the first place, I can't tell you we'd put it back for sure. However, I think where you would probably see things go in that case would actually be errors in the sync process, which you could respond to at the time. Right? We can't get this record for some reason. Why, we don't know. Or I've seen cases where you get rows that show, I'm sure we all have, rows that show up as just question marks, right? And you just can't get rid of them. There's nothing you can do. You can't delete them. Can't do anything. Well, in that case, SyncTech wouldn't have been, Sync Server Pro wouldn't have been able to get that record either. And so before we ever got 2 weeks down the road, you'd know there's a problem collecting that particular record from that table. Well, anything else before I go back?
The question was where it was stored.
Well, there was a question about where it's stored, and there was a question regarding, how is this helping me with corruption if I could store the corruption inside Sync Server Pro? And my answer is you can't really.
Just to verify what you said. Data out as text file, not doing an import out of FileMaker. You do FileMaker, you get whatever data that's corrupted in the data set. That comes from. The only way to clean that is to do the dump to a text file, right? Which
is essentially what we're doing.
It's essentially what you're doing, right? I'm just just backstopping.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate that. Give me an example of what we're talking about. Container data covered. Data formatting, not covered. It's about, at this stage, there used to be a longer list of like, well, not this, not that. It really comes now down to formatted content in fields. So, if you have a letter field, for instance, and users can go in and bold and underline. And we do have kind of a solution for that, but it takes extra work, obviously, on the developer's part. There's a custom function out there that will turn CSS back into formatted content in FileMaker. So through kind of a little trickery where we actually pull the CSS and store that, but as soon as we put it back, a triggered calc turns it back into formatted data. But generally speaking, if somebody's asking me, I'd say, yeah, that's a piece that we can't support.
I would say that's going to be higher feature.
Well, could be. It hasn't been in the past, but I'm certainly hopeful that with the free product and a couple things that we think people can do with it, there's going to be more volume of people using it and more demand for things that matter.
Like Go for a while,
yeah.
So eventually it becomes good.
Yeah.
It's not a real.
We're getting the name info and we're getting the container info. So we're missing certain bits, but essentially the file that we push back into FileMaker. We did have a problem with this in 12 for a period of time where everything was getting resized, but it seemed that with 13 and the updated JDBC drivers, that no longer becomes a problem. So, it's possible we're actually getting a little bit more metadata than we used to. Thumbnail. Yeah, a lot of that stuff is getting recreated for us as we insert back in. But yeah, thank you. Okay, so tier 2. We're just going to discuss this. I don't want to take up too much time. But as we mentioned, there's server-based audit logging. And I just want to talk a little bit more about that, as well as the remote backup and restore. With the audit logging, what you're getting is a table that you can put in any database you want to, on any server you want to. So just to draw an example, I've got a FileMaker server in my office, but maybe I've got a MySQL server in the cloud that I can create databases and tables in. If I want to, I can tell Server Pro, I want to audit this database that's sitting here in my office, but I want to write the audit log over here. So you can choose any database, any server, any table, and it will populate that table. And what you get is a field level listing of anything that changes. And you can filter out what you don't want to see. So certain fields you don't want to have, you don't have to include everything. But for any field you do choose, then you get the who did it, when they did it, what was it before, what was it after, or in the case of deletions, when the record was deleted, and etc. And it's a very handy, I mean, obviously if you have a compliance requirement, it's an obvious thing. You've got to have that audit log, right? You don't have to do it with us, but you've got to have something. But there's a lot more you can do with audit logs. I mean, my favorite use of it, I put it into every customer's database, because if I ever get a call saying, there's a bug or there's a this, 9 times out of 10, I can go into that audit log and I can go, no, see, Audrey did it at 2:30, and she changed it from this to that. So it's very handy. Useful for statistical analysis too. Peak times, this kind of stuff. All these things you can get out of actually seeing what data is really collected. And then with the remote backup and restore, kind of similar to the audit logging, it's just the ability to choose where you're going to write that backup data so that it can be protected outside of your local environment. And the rollback, what I mentioned earlier, this does require a plugin to be installed on a machine that's going to perform a rollback. But essentially what you have is you have this audit log that contains data, and there's plugin functions that can be used to take a set of records that you isolate in that log and roll them back if you want to. So you could find a group of deletes, you could find a bunch of edits, a whole transaction where somebody did a replace routine inadvertently across the entire table instead of the found set, that kind of stuff. So it can be very handy as well. And then let's take a look at tier 3. So we're going to do a hot failover in this case. Let's get back to that. Nothing too fancy. We already did the work. All I'm going to do a little differently this time. I'm going to simulate exactly what happened a few minutes ago. We already made some changes. We already stored them. We already know they're there. I'm going to come back to my server, and I'm going to close this file out again. And of course, it says close them down. All right, and we'll come over here. I'm not going to bother deleting it. Doesn't matter now. What I would typically have, obviously, in a failover environment is 2 servers. I don't have 2 servers on the computer. It's hard to demo that way. So what I've done instead is I've put 2 different files on the same server. It makes absolutely no difference to what's happening in terms of moving parts. This could be a server in another continent, on another continent. So I have another copy of the database called CMC Remote. And so the minute my database went down, I would be staring, potentially, if you want users to. I've been thinking about a few different interesting things you can do with this too. But essentially, I've got this little starter file, very simple. It's got 2 file references. I mean, it's got 1 file reference, 2 lines, 2 different things. Let's just take a look. So if I look at external data sources, I've got 1 single reference, and it's got 2 lines. They happen to both be pointing to the same server, but it's 2 different copies of the database. So to the user who just got told, database just crashed, or database just closed, or what have you, they're looking at their starter file, because that's what they open. Click on it, and now, instead of opening CMC, it's opening CMC Remote, wherever in the world that was. Maybe it's in the other room. I mean, typically disaster recovery, you're not spanning different locations, but you never know.
What's the delay time between getting the first? Got it. And then so it is. What if it's just like a hole? Okay, my question is about how long is that? Oh, that fast. Okay. Not like 90 seconds.
Yeah. You have your change the first reference to
Sure. Just so I can leave this, showing you it's here. I opened up the other copy. The record's already there. So you're saying on the first line, just end of the line.
Well, but it's going to see the file's not there. What if it went out to like 9 servers? Below that.
Yeah.
Put a bogus and just randomly something different. This is the worst. Yeah, this is the worst.
Yeah, I get your point. So in this case now, when I click it, it's going to spend some amount of time unnecessarily looking for reference 1. Yeah.
This is important to know because if you blow a server, a lot of times it's not going to be responding.
Yeah, yeah. And there's no control, there's no timeout control over any of this, obviously. That's just all built in.
Well, wish list items, right? Your engineering, please add us.
Well, yeah, that would be interesting. So I've just had some thoughts about ways you could kind of extend off of this.
Oh, that was it. 30 seconds.
It wasn't too bad. Yeah.
That's not too bad for
I'm not going to bother opening that.
resurrection.
So I mean, here I'm assuming there's a one-window environment. You know, when my main window goes away, this window's still here. The user knows to click. But really, you could kind of really go to town with this. I mean, you could put a timer on it, and it could try every 30 seconds and test if the database isn't open, or 10 seconds. I mean, you could have this collecting information about the state that the user's in, so that, in fact, when they click here, it takes them right back to the quote. That's all stuff you'd have to program, but that's simple FileMaker stuff, right? So you could really leverage this and build out from it and do some pretty cool stuff. All right, let's see how we're doing on time. Thank you. That's right. That's right. This definitely. That's right.
So you're not finding it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Which this is the poor man's hot failover.
Well, exactly.
You can definitely buy equipment and other things that would make it. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are options that will immediately know that server's no longer available and switch it over. So absolutely. Just, all right, so let's take a look. I think we're just we're through the demo stuff at this point. Any questions about the hot failover situation or the hot-ish failover situation that we looked at? Very warm. Okay.
I like the fact that we didn't have to use the command line to resurrect.
Well, all right, so we talked about that. Let's just discuss a little bit more. I'm going to just pull all these up. Yeah. So I'll look at the, or I'll point this out a little bit. But basically, when you create your settings for your solutions, you control one of the settings you have control over is what's the polling time, and our recommended time is 60 seconds. Don't really recommend in a production environment you go below, let's say, 30 seconds, because you are cranking things up and you're doing some resource activity. But certainly 1 minute has been bread and butter for people for quite a while. So what happens, and actually this will be a little easier to illustrate in just a couple slides, but don't let me forget to come back to that. So we talked about multi-server sync as well, right? That's, I'm not just doing disaster recovery. I've got offices all over the place. And I just want to point out we also do enterprise customizations. So a couple of the kinds of things we sometimes do for people. I talked a little bit about the smart launcher file with maximum failover heat. But a couple of the other kinds of things we do. Is that a hand for a question? We will set up automated processes to detect schema changes. So, using FileMaker's SQL ability, you can find out. And so we have some scripts and things that we do so that if you do have a very busy server with lots of developers and there's nobody who knows who's doing what, these kinds of techniques can be added to what Sync Server Pro is adding to make sure that that secondary server always has the latest stuff. And so this also includes sometimes just making automated mechanisms to move the files over every night so that server A always or server B always has what ended up being the end of the day stuff from server A. So these are the kinds of things that aren't really built into the product. They're things that obviously our fellow developers can do for their clients, and they're things that we are happy to do as well. Well, okay, so a schema change in and of itself without any customization, yeah, no, you have to do steps to push that. What I'm saying is, as a service to some of our clients, we've built systems to bolt on to this that do that for them. So it's certainly possible to do, it's just not in the product itself.
If you say that your product does that, then I'm just going to quote me with an
Well,
throw $100 bills.
we will bear that.
I mean,
We will bear that in mind. Give us the ability to push schema into FileMaker more effectively, and we'll certainly sync it. I mean, that'd be a no-brainer, for sure. And who knows, maybe that'll come. Right. So we, by the way, we have features to create that missing field. We do that. Automatically add the field, because it's the only thing we can do. We can't add that other table occurrence that you added while you were making the field, and we can't put the field on the layout and give it a pop-up menu. And, you know, it's that stuff. We'd have to have some form of XML ability to project it in or something. FileMaker gave us GUID IDs. They're better. You need IDs to show your customers. Have fields that do that, but don't rest your data integrity on that increment. Is my answer. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about the setup process. One of the things we say, you got to have a GUID. Now, technically speaking, if I'm just doing audit logging or I'm just doing backup and restore, and you could almost get away with just keeping serial increments, but for best practices reason, we chose to say, do the GUID and wait for somebody to complain and say, wait, I gotta, you know, and then we can work out if it's something they can do. But honestly, I mean, there's just so many things that serial number increments make it complicated. You know, making a new copy of the database and forgetting to reset, just so many things. All right, so I have some screenshots of the simple setup, the tier 1 setup that I just wanted to show. So here we have the wizard environment that you walk through to get your solution set up. And the very first question is, you know, what do you want to do? Because I have the free product here, I can't pick the other items. It's just local backup. But you see audit logging, remote backup, and server sync are also options. So there's 6 steps. Most of them are pretty darn straightforward. You do require an account called Sync Server. And the reason we do that is so that we know if we ever have to do any protections of activity that shouldn't happen when the replication is occurring, we know there's a particular account to use. So that's really the only reason. Give it any password you want. You do have to make that password also have access to ODBC, JDBC, as well as XML. Ensure that every table occurrence you wish to include has a primary key field that uses a GUID. Every table occurrence that you want to include, there is a table occurrence for every base table that matches the name of the base table. So as our way of filtering these 5,000 table occurrences that you have and knowing which ones actually represent unique tables, we chose to simplify things. It used to be you had to pick. Now we just say, you know what, have a base table. I mean, is that really a bad idea anyway? So base table that sits on the graph, table occurrence that sits on the graph, the same as the base table. Then there are 3 things that you do to your database / tables, but they're all cut and paste. So, you know, nothing onerous here. There's 3 tables that are required. There's 3 fields, 3 tables. So 3 fields per table that you want to include. We tried to get away from not having any field requirements, but we got to have a host timestamp in order to know reliably that this record really changed at this time. If you've got users coming in from different environments, different time zones, somebody's clock is wacky, it just doesn't work. So, and once we needed the 1, we figured 3 was better. That would, no. All right, so then there is kind of an optional step that comes up sometimes. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I'll just do an example. You've got a line item table, and user picks a product ID, and then the salesman can go over to the unit price and change it, right? They just changed the auto entry behavior. Well, there's nothing to prevent, there's no way to prevent any mechanism other than import with auto entry off from potentially, while I'm pushing that record into another system, re-triggering that auto entry and corrupting what should have been the data. So there is a potential protection mechanism that you do have to or could have to do. We make it as easy as possible. You give us a DDR, We process that. We find every one that's a likelihood. We give you a full report and tell you exactly what to make the calc. And really, all it is a wrapper. It just says if the get account name equals sync server, don't do anything. Otherwise, do whatever you would have done. And then the final step: install the engine on your server. Open up ODBC, JDBC sharing on the server as well as XML, and enable FMSE and WPE, the web publishing engine, to be able to run plugins.
So this is a Java-based engine, correct?
This is a Java-based engine.
You know what question I'm going to ask? You should have it. Yeah.
Sure. Well, no, actually.
What kind of version of Java? How sensitive is it? Right? Oh, my left foot in the air.
Supremely insensitive.
Sure.
Yeah. There was one version of Java on one platform that ever broke something, and it was the transitional. No, it was actually right before the transition from Apple to Sun for Java. They released a terrible version, 1.59, I think, that just whacked things out, and it was really just a workaround to fix a bug. Every other version of Java that's ever come out works seamlessly, and the reason is because we don't do any interface in Java, right? The thing that constantly breaks apps that are built with Java is all that interface stuff keeps changing. How it interacts with the OS changes. We don't do any of that. Look, you could even use serial increments if you had some way of making sure that site A and site B wouldn't create the same ones, right? It's just a lot of extra overhead on you anytime you want to redeploy. But there's different techniques people have used over time to even use serial increments. All right, so those are the setup requirements. And plus, you know, like I say, we've written these requirements around a product that you might start using one way tomorrow and then decide 2 days later you want to come in here and say, oh, I'm going to turn on audit logging. We know that if we have you do it one way, one time, it's going to meet all needs. But technically speaking, for audit logging, for backup and restore, you could probably get away with incremental. You'd still need the timestamps, but you could get away with serial increments. It's the fact that you might have two servers and what could happen if two users create records in the same time. All right. We looked at that. So just to kind of zoom in on this, there's really just one, beyond the setup requirements, there's kind of one information page. You're telling us what database server you want to work with, what's the name of the database, what's the account, password, and just in case the web host is different from the primary, you can change that as well. And you're also telling us what the 3 field names are. You know, we recommend you paste in our fields, but if you didn't happen to, or you have your own that meet the same satisfied requirements, you can simply tell us what those fields are before we collect the schema. And then when we do collect the schema, oh, and by the way, I like this a lot. This was an improvement over SyncDeck. We do keep your primary keys, so we're not giving you a primary key to use. And if you happen to do a convention that I think a lot of developers do, which is put a prefix, a common prefix in front of your primary key field names, then you can just specify that prefix, and then in the next step when we pick up the schema, we fill it all out for you. If you don't, it's just one little extra step where you go down the list of tables and you would specify which particular primary key for that table. But as long as you do have commonly named fields, literally you put in that one page, you click collect, and you're essentially done. I did want to show the tier 3 setup because I think it's kind of cool, and it comes back to a little bit of your question. So one difference in the tier 3 setup, because there's lots of parts, and this used to be one of the most complicated things about SyncDeck, is you had to kind of independently know to go put part here and part there and then connect the parts. So it's now all done through one screen. Each of those little green checkboxes is a pop-up that has configuration information associated with it. And then as soon as you specify it and click continue, it checks that connection and makes sure you're okay. So this is literally my entire 2-server environment. And you can see there's a few different parts involved. There's the connection from this database file to my sync engine. And of course, there's 2 different sync engines, so I have to have a connection to each one. There's from that sync engine to the database server. And so you configure some of that same stuff we were just looking at. Is it on the same machine? Is it localhost? What's the name of the database? That kind of stuff. And then finally, there's the how do the 2 sync engines talk to each other? And this brings up a little bit of our architecture. What we have is a hub process. That hub process could run anywhere in the world, typically runs on one of the 2 machines hosting one of the sync engines. It's the hub process that the engines talk to, not the database servers. So database server goes down, that doesn't necessarily mean communication is broken down between the 2. And so this little pop-up, you just pick, is it on primary, is it on secondary, and the bits and pieces move around on the screen to reflect how you've configured your environment. But this one setup screen allows me to set up all the complexity of how to have a two-server environment, wherever those servers might be and whatever types of servers there might be. I don't know if that ultimately answered the question you'd asked, but I guess the bottom line is whether or not a particular engine is online, whether or not a particular database is online, the system isn't going to break down. The system is going to throw some errors saying connection didn't happen, but everything that it may have just pulled from the database that it's ready to ship off to another server is still queued, it's still packaged up, it's compressed, it's waiting to go next time, so that you have the most efficient communication, and you don't have to go back to the database and start the whole process over again. And that's typically called store and forward.
Okay, store and forward.
Store and forward. So we do this in phases. We talk to the database locally and we get the changes. We package those up and then we ship them to where they're going to go, whether it's an audit log or to the hub process or what have you. And then it's that hub process that the other engines connect to and pull data down.
So we can have 3 servers with this?
You can have 3. Yeah, the base product comes with 2. You could have 50.
Okay, so it's not like a automatic limitation.
No, not at all. This interface was designed around 2.
Right.
And that's one of the things we were able to do with FileMaker 14. So much easier to build layouts and build interface that we were able to build wizards around each of the different kinds of activities you'd be doing rather than this sort of one-size-fits-all. So I think that brings me to the end. So if anybody has any questions, I put some information up here. We'll have some cards as well. Yeah. The version of, you have to have FileMaker 14 to run the interface file, but that could be Pro. Server itself, 12 through 14. No more 11. We cut that one out. It's just too difficult. First of all, we do field level conflict detection and resolution, and there are actually customizable rules if you want to apply them. The default rule is get newest. So that just means we're doing a merge when there is a conflict to whatever extent possible. Beyond that, if a conflict does occur, there is logging of the actual records involved and sort of what happened, but it's making an automated decision. So there's no user prompting, there's no putting things into people's inbox to make decisions about. I actually tried that in the first version of SyncDeck we built about 15 years ago, thinking that was really cool. And nobody who ever is asked to make the decision ever knows the answer, so it's worthless. It's far better to make an automated decision, but we do log it. And in a minute-long cycle or something along those lines in a server environment, you're also heavily mitigated. And design considerations would come into play too. I mean, if you have, for instance, a notes field and people are banging in that thing all day long and you're constantly hitting conflicts, maybe it's time to redesign it and make them line items, that kind of stuff. So yes, deployment assistant. Let me jump in here. So we've added redeployment help, basically. So we've come up with a few different scenarios that you might be doing in a redeployment situation. The very first of them is the one I showed you at the beginning of the demo. We're recovering from a crash with an untouched backup. In other words, nobody's monkeyed with that backup. It's just the backup that was made. But what we're recommending or suggesting you might find useful is the ability to do offline development. And the ideal scenario for that would be you take your backup copy, let's say you make it today, you take it away, you work on it, you develop on it for a couple weeks. You don't change the data. You don't just do willy-nilly testing and corrupt what data is in that copy. You need to do that, you make another copy, mess with that, and come back to this one. So that when you have finished development, you still have the state of the data that was in that database when you grab it. Essentially, the exact same process you saw me do for the recovery, you can do with that database. And the big advantage here is instead of re-importing 15 gigabytes of data, you're now having Sync Server Pro push in 10 megabytes or whatever, some smaller set of what changed since you made the backup. So that can be very handy. Not always doable. Sometimes what you have is you got to make a clone. You do your development, or you've got 10 clients that all use the same system. You got to walk in with a clone. I say walk in because I want to measure that. You don't have to walk in with a clone. You can. You could actually pre-populate it. You could pre-populate that copy offline before you ever arrive at the client with everything up to the day you decide to do it. So maybe it has been 2 weeks, or you're starting with a clone, you got to put in many megabytes or gigabytes of data. You could still do all of that before you ever arrive at the client, and then simply do a roll forward from the point at which you started that process. So let's say I started this morning, I grabbed, I told it to start a roll forward on the system, not the live system, but my own little offline copy, and it's chugging away all day, I don't care. It's finally finished, I'm ready to go into the client. I walk in with a practically filled version of the database, except it started from this morning, and now all I have to do is the exact same thing you saw me do earlier, one more roll forward from this morning. So I have to wait until 6, till they're done, that's fine. 15 minutes later, I'm done. I'm out of it. So the other options that you can do involve sync environments. So if you happen to have a multi-node environment, you can easily grab the copy of the database from any particular node and replace the other, and the product will automatically bring that copy up to date. So if I made it at 5, I copied it over server 2 at 7, it'll just automatically fill in the 2 hours that were missing after I made that backup. Yeah. Right. Right. That is handled in that scenario. So what we say, let's say for instance with the clone version, and the reason we put this in here is because this would be a scary thing if you didn't have a few instructions to tell you what to do. But it's really not that onerous. There are some best practices. In that development copy, we wouldn't recommend you do things like delete tables and fields, or even rename them, because that's going to make it pretty difficult. But if you're adding new stuff to it, that's fine. But one of the steps we tell you to do in that case is to run the process that updates the product's knowledge of the schema. So essentially, before you roll that copy forward, you tell the product, hey, refresh your knowledge of the schema, and it now knows what's in there. It's still going to take what data it can from the old system, which doesn't include those new fields. It's just not going to put any data where there was no data put. Is that anything else? Okay. Cool. Well, thank you guys very much. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, there's a question on that. Nope, it completely does its own thing. It has no, it doesn't rely on you having any of that set up. And yeah. I can't speak to an obvious number. I can say, 15 years of doing this, the overhead in a normal production environment, typically unnoticed. Typically unnoticed. I'm not going to say there's never been a customer who came along and said, hey, can you help us out? And when they explained that they change about 1 million records a day, I had to say, no, we can't keep up. I mean, there are cases like that. But insofar as the product is able to keep up with the data flow, impact to the actual users is just not even a tech support question we take. I mean, it's really not something that happens. Yeah. I have one environment where it's kind of one of those corporate situations I was talking about. They've got, I think, 300 different databases on their server, from all different departments and what have you. And there's one set of syncing preferences that goes through all of those tables. Some of those tables have millions of records. I've never heard a peep out of anybody saying, any performance issue whatsoever. It takes a few minutes to run through a cycle. But it's, it's iteratively going through tables, and it's doing the query on the table, and it's collecting what changed only. So it's, it's a reasonably minimal. Doesn't really matter how big the table is. It just matters how much volume. And if I did just pull, let's say, 500,000 records, yeah, you might see a slight hit to performance as it's chunking through those. But those are usually going to be the cases where it's an unusual, let's say, a monthly batch routine that goes through.
We have a database where we import 100,000.
Yeah. Yeah. Typically, I would say the size of our data tends to be roughly reflective of the size of the FileMaker database itself. Even though we're compressing, we're storing a little bit more info. So, you know, there's a bit, and you know, obviously it's going to vary between a record that's very large. So, you know, you got 100 records, but they're all very big. Our compression is going to make things a bit smaller versus very small records, but there's tons and tons of them. It's still going to be, you know, roughly as big as the FileMaker database itself. We do store all of our binary data outside of that database. We've been doing that for longer than external data storage, but yeah, it just made the most sense. All right. Excellent. Thank you all very much. Oh, yeah. Well, you know, it is a good question. I mean, there is one competitor. 360 Works, I guess, in a certain sense, would be the only one out there. You know, there's some other sync technologies for FileMaker at this point, but they're all focused on Go. Other than 360 Works, you know, I mean, we've been doing this for 15 years. I think we have some pretty deep experience of what's required to make things work, and I think you'll find that there's a lot more tools in this system to accommodate when things go wrong. I didn't really talk about them tonight, but there's something called a special publishing that allows you to overcome some kind of a breakdown. Let's say somebody corrupted the server, or, you know, for whatever reason you can't query. There's mechanisms that let you just say, hey, look, okay, I want to push all the data from a particular table that was changed after a certain timestamp. Yeah. So there's just these types of tools that I think make this a very mature product that's been around for a long time and had a lot of customers and gone through the things that you need to have to sort of keep an environment up and running. We do use JDBC for the bulk of our data communication, and it's a lot less verbose than the XML, and I think a bit more stable at this point. But obviously every rev comes out and improvements are made, so a comparison in 14 might yield different results. But I'd say at a certain point, when we looked at using the XML interface, we found it more likely to break down and more chatty. You know, there's a lot more data being passed through those mechanisms. So we use the XML so that we can trigger a script server side to help with deletion detection. And that's really the only reason we have that connection open. But all of the real data transfer back and forth is through JDBC. If you'd asked me 15 years ago, I would have said, I don't know why we're doing this. It's impossible. Yes. So what are some of the things that make FileMaker particularly challenging to do replication for versus, let's say, SQL Server or Oracle or something like that? I mean, certainly Oracle has the most sophisticated replication tools of anybody. That's what they have in the internet. But you know, the things that were challenging and remain challenging for FileMaker in this age, you know, if you want to support MySQL database, you don't have to make any changes to your schema at all. We do it all for you because there's triggers, for instance. I can create a series of triggers that will do add, change, and delete detection automatically. I don't need you to add extra fields as long as you're using it. So there are certain aspects to FileMaker that do make it more challenging. And of course, the fact that FileMaker has so much more capability packed into the file. You know, fields are on layouts, fields have auto entry, fields. With the other database systems, you really don't have to worry about that. So if I'm trying to keep two MySQL servers in sync, my answer is, yeah, I'll build a schema for you. The minute you add it to one, it's in the other, and whatever you do is some other web interface, right? So that I don't have to replicate that. So with FileMaker, there is some of that kind of challenge where people would love to have more ability to just schema and everything gets updated. So it's those things more than anything. You know, the speed of pushing data into FileMaker is a little slower than some of the other ones, but that's not really a challenge for offering a product. It's just a factor, I guess. Yeah. Okay, I think that's it. Again, thank you.
All right, everyone. We appreciate you attending the FileMaker Dig FM meeting. We'll catch you next month. Don't forget to check for the latest signups and availability at FileMakerUserGroup.com. Good night.